Good evening, Mike. Ellen, agus as a bhailte sin agus táimid agus ásadan ver láthir a nacht. So I would like to thank everybody in the University of Wales and in Jesus College, Oxford, for this invitation to speak to you this evening. I do feel that maybe at the end of the talk, you will initiate a prosecution against me under the Trades Descriptions Act, because I presented the talk as traveling in the age of the Anthropocene, and I certainly would be happy to talk about ecological and environmental issues as they relate to travel in our discussion after the talk. But I think what I wanted to look at this evening was specifically the question of what it is to travel in a minor language. You know, are there certain kinds of specific questions or problematics and so on that come up with traveling in a minor language as opposed to a major language? And in preparing this talk, it sort of brought me back to a book that I worked on a number of years ago, Across the Lines, Travel, Language and Translation, where basically I was, one of the things that kind of puzzled me was the very, very extensive literature that you find on travel writing, which is kind of, you know, burgeoned in the last 3 or 4 decades, but just how neglected the topic of language was in the critical writing on travel itself. So I began to, if you like, look into this topic. And one of my guides in doing so was the Russian linguist Hermann Jakobson, and that famous kind of tripartite distinction that he makes with respect to translation itself, where he talks about the interlingual, the interlingual, and the intersemiotic. So basically, I use this kind of categorization to look at travel accounts. So in the first section, it was looking at what happens for English language traveler writers, British travel writers going to the United States, US travel writers going to England, Irish Anglophones traveling to the US or Canada, and so on. So the second then was the more familiar association we have with translation. So people traveling to countries where they speak a different language. So what happens when Bruce Chapman goes to Patagonia and he speaks the kind of Spanish that he speaks, and how does this influence his perception of place? And finally was an intersemiotic travel, where people don't have any command or grasp of the language, and how do they use alternative forms of communication in order to establish a relationship with people. And to some extent, the book itself was sort of, there was 2 parts to it. One was basically looking at travel writing as a kind of translation. And the second part, the last 2 chapters of the book, were looking at translation itself as a kind of travel writing, thinking about the translator as a kind of travel writer. But one of the things that I didn't look at was the question of what it might mean to travel in a minor key. What would it mean or feel like if one was to travel in a minor language as opposed to a major language? And one of the things I discovered in beginning to work and look at this area is there's a very significant body of travel writing in the Irish language, but it's a genre that was pretty much neglected, certainly in the 20th century, post-independence travel writing, because there was a certain sense, I think, of generic disdain for travel writing. It was seen as part of genre fiction, like science fiction or detective writing and so on. And therefore, it hadn't kind of the requisite literary credentials to be taken seriously as a form of writing in the Irish language. So what I'm going to do this evening then is basically to think about travel writing and minority in terms of the duality of impact. So I see this as taking two forms, one representational and the other instrumental. So what I mean by representational impact is to what extent does one's knowledge or lack of knowledge of the language of a particular place influence the way in which you represent that place to your readers. And the second, the instrumental, is to do with what is the effect of the language of travel itself on the language communities with which it comes into contact. In other words, if you are somebody who speaks a major language, you're traveling as speaker of that major language, what is the difference in terms of your impact on language communities as opposed to someone who speaks a minor language? So this is one of the questions that I want to, if you like, keep in mind this evening. So the two accounts that I'm going to look at are, one was an account that was published in 1977, authored by Pádraig Ó Fianachta, called Óráid Gefásach, and another more recent account that came out in 2015, called Ashti Orpacha by Taig Connolly. So a word or two about the authors. Pádraig Ó Fianachta may, I think, be known to perhaps some of you in this seminar. He was the professor of modern Irish in Maynooth for an extended period. He was the principal translator of the Catholic Bible into modern Irish. He was a native speaker of Irish from the West Kerry Gaeltacht. So he is somebody, if you like, who in this book, which is basically an account of a 3-week journey to northwestern Kenya, he's somebody, if you like, who is primed for an interest or a sensitivity to the question of language difference. The other writer, Tarlath Connolly, did a BA Modern Languages in University College Dublin, went on to do a PhD in linguistics in Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. And his PhD was sort of on the history or aspects of the history of linguistic thought, but particularly as they relate to Celtic languages. He was principally interested in the way in which the study of Celtic languages, particularly in the 19th century, influenced particular philosophical traditions in Europe, in German and French, and thinking about the nature of language itself. And in 2005, he published Irsmi na Teanga Celtia Istar Smoinchkis na Hjorpe, which is basically looking at the role of Celtic languages in the philosophical traditions of Europe. In 2009, he published a book, Muintir Sleva Oxiteanga Loch na Romanische Snelvesh, which is a look at the Romansh language in Switzerland, the country that he now lives in. So again, you can see this is somebody with these kind of prior interests in language and language difference. So what happens then when starting with Pádraig Ó Fianachta, he is preparing to go to Kenya. How is he thinking? Well, the first thing is that he is thinking about language. He's thinking about language difference. And he does two things. He goes out and does that brave thing. Nowadays, people do this with Duolingo apps, but you buy yourself to teach yourself a Swahili book and bravely soldier through the first 4 chapters, and then it often gets left aside. But he takes on this task. He acquires the book, but he says very soon, so he was very unhappy. So what he does then is he establishes contact with a student in Maynooth called Boniface, who's a Swahili speaker from Kenya, and he took language lessons with him. So he sort of, if you like, priming himself for that particular contact. But of course, the problem that he finds and the difficulty, and I think this is something that has all kinds of consequences in terms of travel, language acquisition, thinking about translation, and so on, is this question of temporal asymmetry. One of the difficulties in late modernity is when we're used to this notion of instantaneous time, with the acceleration of time, the rapidity of access to knowledge in various forms, is that language learning is a crucifyingly slow and difficult process. And it requires enormous amounts of time. It requires enormous investments of time. So what you're getting very quickly is this kind of temporal discrepancy between the necessary time that's required to learn and assimilate a non-cognate language like Swahili, and the time that he has at his disposal. So what does he do then, or what happens? Before I describe what happens, I just want to say a word or two about the sort of the mental context for Ofinachta before he goes on this journey. He is acutely aware of the kind of colonial histories of the region. For example, before he heads off, he talks about a meeting with a man called Colonel O'Neill, who was very instrumental in developing links between Irish language and Scots Gaelic speakers in the area of language and music. O'Neill had worked as part of the UN peacekeeping force in the what was then the Belgian Congo, and he recounts a story which is then told to us by Ofinachta, that at one stage, as part of this mission, he was making a speech to a group of local people, and that he had his speech, which was written in French, translated into Swahili. O'Neill had already learned some Swahili before he went on the mission, and he was sort of coached in pronunciation. So he gives a speech in both French and Swahili to the intense anger of the Belgian officials, who basically blackballed him subsequently from further engagement with that population. So he's aware, if you like, that when that languages are occurring in particular kinds of contexts, but he's also aware of the fact that he's going over there to meet Catholic missionaries, and he is aware of the role of many Catholic missionary orders in the teaching of major languages in the region, whether it be French or English, depending on the different parts of Africa that we're talking about. So there's a sense in which there is this kind of post-colonial sensitivity on the part of Ofinachta before he goes to Kenya, and seeing language as occurring in a particular context. So how does this sensitivity then play itself out? Well, one of the ways that it plays itself out, and this is a kind of classic strategy in travel writing, is the use of what's called lexical exoticism. And this is basically where you kind of pepper your text with words or phrases in the local languages. So what we find in Ofinachta's account it's mainly words rather than phrases from Swahili, Kikuyu, and Turkana. And the idea behind this is that, and this is going back to the scientific revolution in the 17th century, and only believing what you can see with your eyes, the notion of a kind of ocular centrism, is that by seeing these foreign words on the page, it kind of reinforces the credibility of witness of the person who's gone to the particular place, because the language themselves and their very foreignness on the page are indicators of that contact, the presence of another language, another space on the printed page. So this is part of his strategy. The other part is establishing what you might call a particular kinds of linguistic alliances with people who are Irish speakers like himself, but who are based in the region. So one of his friends, Caoimhín, is a fluent speaker of Turkana. Another speaker, Pádraig, is a fluent speaker of Swahili. So they act, if you like, as kind of cultural brokers or intermediaries for him as he sort of negotiates this different space. So at one point, for example, in this religious service, he has a poem translated into Turkana, and he recites the original Irish language poem that he wrote and the Turkana translation. One of the points that was made by the famous American anthropologist James Clifford in his book Travel and Translation in the 20th century Roots was that there's always a tension in travel writing between what he calls traveling in dwelling and dwelling in traveling. The Swiss-French travel writer Nicolas Bouvier talked about s'attacher, s'arracher, that you become attached to a place, you begin to set down roots, and then you uproot yourself to move somewhere else. And so what you find then in the case of Fionachta is this perpetual tension between the fact of, he's been there as a traveler, for a particular period of time, the fact that he's got to spatially discover these very large regions. So this is put in tension with his intense desire to kind of dwell in that place, to take part in the activities of his friends, so involving himself in some of the instructions in the schools, some of the works in the villages, and so on. So in other words, that the attempts at, and crucial of course to that, the experience of dwelling, to a form of vertical traveling as opposed to horizontal traveling, is the acquisition of language, or the attempt to construct, if you like, bridges, language bridges through the intermediary of his friends. But one of the things, of course, that travel does, and language difference, is to constantly remind him of his transient or nomadic presence as a traveler. One of the ideas that's challenged in Fionachta's account, we find this less in Tarlach Connolly's, but is the ready association between language and territory. And what I mean by that is the kind of notion that languages are spatially defined, and they're contained within particular spaces. So in other words, one of the things that emerges in the various encounters that he has is his realization that it's not just people who travel, that languages travel too. So when he goes to Kenya, he meets these fellow missionaries who are Irish speakers, and they're speaking about and describing foreign realities in the Irish language. If you like, here they are in a context that is not the familiar kind of Anglophone context that they will be used to in Ireland, but it's a Kikuyu, it's a Turkana, it's a Swahili or Kiswahili context. So that this, if you like, creates a different kind of context then for the speaking or the use of that minority language. And one of the things that he does when he's there is he conducts various services for Irish language expatriates who were working in Kenya at the time. But this sense of what we might call language kinship extends beyond Irish itself. And it extends to his encounters with Welsh. One of the books that was produced by Pádraig Ó Fiannacht, one of his first books that came out in 1957, was a book called An Chomharsa Chuimhneach, The Foreign Neighbour, which was his account of his a period spent learning Welsh, studying the language, and traveling through Wales in the second half of the 1950s. And one of the incidents that he talks about is meeting a Welsh nurse in a place called Tika, which is outside Nairobi. And she comes from Blaenau Festiniog, and she is delighted to find another speaker of Welsh, as he is too. And they spend the evening singing Welsh songs, and much to the delight and bemusement of some of their friends and colleagues. And interestingly, all of the titles of the Welsh songs are left untranslated in his Welsh language account. So one of the things that, if you like, that Ó Fiannacht is doing here is he's kind of destabilizing I think association between language and territory, but also a kind of notion that it is only major languages that become lingua francas, that minor languages have their own potential for particular kinds of language networks. And of course, to some extent, this is partly the idea that Pamela Petro had in her book Travels in an Old Tongue, touring the world speaking Welsh, where, of course, you know, for all the Welsh speakers, you know, her idea was that that by speaking to Welsh speakers outside of Wales, that she were in non-Anglophone contexts primarily, that would give her the possibility or the opportunity to speak Welsh in less fraught contexts. But I suppose what kind of interests me about the book is this attempt to think through what kind of minor language global networks and nomadic networks might look like. One of the a kind of a repeated motif in Bhuaig go Fásach is this notion of ceist an dá chultúr. One of the things that Ó Fiannacht finds very depressing is that English and not Turkana is the official language of many of the schools in northwestern Kenya. And at one point he meets a group of students in Kaiboi in the Rift Valley, and they repeatedly talk about this tension between indigenous cultures and Western cultures, primarily around practices like spitting or institutions of polygamy and so on. These are the ones that tend to be picked out. But it's interesting that although Ó Fiannacht can be quite self-reflexive in terms of colonial past, colonial contexts, linguistic sensitivities, he also engages in his own form of what the German anthropologist Johannes Fabian calls denial of coevalness. So denial of coevalness is basically the idea, this kind of traditional Western trope, which is that the Western traveler was the sort of the embodiment of modernity, and when they went to other places, they saw kind of snapshots from their past, that other places were always irretrievably situated in a kind of pre-modern past, you know, which could be inspected or valued, often with great, you know, nostalgia or whatever, by the Western traveler. So, and we find this there's a particular scene where there's groups of young warriors who are preparing for kind of local battle. And O'Fianach is there, and he describes this is like a scene out of the Táin Bolchoilne, the cattle raid of Cooley. So, you know, immediately kind of dehistoricizing this group of people and putting them back into a previous period. So there's this certain kind of exoticism to which he succumbs at various moments in the book itself. Towards the end of O Bhai go Fásach, there is a passage which I just it's a brief passage which I want to read and then say one or two things about it. He says, "Chorus egum nua, chorus vech shevehe near hirem nasik hein, chorus not mehr barrel briste mar cloth toish to the house, ach tishkent teamplocht, agus corin asik mar vloha Kiev." So his notion then that what he saw as a potential future for that part of Kenya that he spent time in is the emergence of a culture of a world, a language and a cultural world that would be judged by its own standards and not, to use that famous phrase of Daedalus at the beginning of Ulysses, to be ever judged in the cracked looking glass of the servant. But the way he talks about it is that this would be a flowering, would be seeing an understanding of the environment and of the community of the desert. So to some extent, what we see here, almost in a kind of proto-ecological way, in this book from 1977, is that he's intuiting an understanding of biocultural diversity, that there's some fundamental and crucial link between environment and language that is going to ensure the resilience or the stability or sustainability of these particular communities. And he's kind of echoing something that would be articulated by Aaron Stibbe in his ecolinguistics book from 2015, where he sees ecolinguistics as critiquing forms of language that contribute to ecological destruction and aiding in the search for new forms of language to inspire people to protect the natural world. So to some extent, in his own particular way and using the kind of metaphorical language that he uses, O'Fianach is kind of moving towards or suggesting a kind of sensitivity moving in that direction. And I want to look at someone who is very different in many ways from O'Fianach, different generation, a different world, one very much secular world as opposed to kind of mixed secular religious world of O'Fianach. And this is Carlach Machonmi. Early on in the book, Machonmi kind of sets out his stall, right? Where he says, "Slatan Johan ban Eirlish down an la Hawks nach Vain, Dan Astral is get the winter Maheren on Yarmine, ach ni mar sinna vi tjal, o vision Eirich na manach Gailach Savalnish, but he imach na Gioli of the Gain of Fiania, the Ursan Noel Giv evor in the Hjorta, as the Tash Communic or here Gatir. Yoga, Skim and Yarsham or Eirich Loch Late in the Reinja, a Herjavalish in order Barish, August Neil la down and Verla Vine. Van een chagla shinaveg dinner, kahi chankafe ege rigate dol shias. So they're called European essays, Ashti Orpa. And to some extent, what Machonmi is doing in his travels, in his travel account, is trying out or testing the notion that his Irish readers or his Irish readership need to get back in touch with this European history or culture that they've lost, and that crucially goes through a sensitivity to language itself. He goes in his kind of the map of Europe that we find in this book. To some extent, it's quite a wayward map. It's got a wayward journey. He goes from kind of Freiburg in high school in Germany, St. Gallen in Switzerland. We've got the town of Chur in Switzerland. Then we've got Vienna. We've got Montignola, Naples in Italy, Ceres in northern Greece. And one of the things that we find is this kind of continual tension between the language of the travel narration itself, which is Irish, and then the languages of the various communities that he describes. One of the notions that he uses repeatedly in the book is this notion of language world. So what does he mean by language world? Basically, he means that your language world is all of those stories that you hear as a child, the books that you read as a youngster, the films you saw, the writers you quote, and so on. And that language worlds have their own kind of internal coherence. So his argument is that for major languages, that this question of language world is a relatively uncomplicated matter. Not so sure that I entirely agree with them about that. But that in the case of minority languages, this becomes deeply problematic. Trying to maintain some form of internal coherence in these worlds becomes problematic. So, and this is one of the things that he's going to explore in his travels. At one point, he arrives in the monastery in Saint Gallen, and he looks at the Irish at the manuscripts that are there with the Irish marginalia, and in particular he looks at Codex Sangalensis 904, where there are these interlinear glosses in Old Irish, which are kind of displaying words and phrases in Christian's Latin grammar. And so he sees this, what he calls a glush imel erláshkim, that the Irish kind of occupying this kind of marginal space on the manuscript. He thinks about this notion of the marginal as a way of trying to resituate a minority language in an alternative geography, an alternative history. So part of the reason, if you like, for going to St. Gallen, for looking at these particular glosses, is looking at the language, looking at the presence of the language in a very different, a non-habitual context in a particular way. So at one level, what he does is fairly straightforward, is that he is on his travels picking out the traces of Irish language culture in different parts of Europe. When he goes to Vienna, for example, he talks about the Schotten Stift, the Schotten Tor, the Schotten Ring, and about the presence of Irish scholars in the court of Duke Heinrich II in the 12th century. So this, one could argue, is something that you might expect, because what he's doing is he's saying, look, this is a kind of a history of Irish presence in Europe that's ignored in major language travel accounts, because the language of the narration inflects or affects the kinds of things that one pays narrative attention to. So by narrating this in Irish, I'm going to pick out a different or an alternative history of Irish language traces on the continent. But there's also, I think, another way of viewing this, which is how he himself presents it, where he says, and he's using again this kind of image from the codex. He says, "Ní raibh leis na Gael ach a gcuid scríobh in interstices, nó barnaí an discourse sin, imel on Latin no idir melinse. So in other words, what Connolly does in this work is that rather than sort of reflecting on the kind of the golden age of the Irish language and Irish scholarship, a kind of an itis aria of linguistic plenitude, he argues that even back in this period where Latin was the dominant language of the church, that these kind of marginal glosses by these Irish monks were already, if you like, an indication of a certain kind of peripherality. But what he sort of goes on to argue then in his travels, and he's traveled by going to places like Freiburg and Breisgau, St. Gallen, Ceres. They're going a little off the beaten track in this kind of interstitial traveling, is to suggest that this kind of peripherality, rather than being a weakness, may be a kind of strength. I think this book it comes out in 2015. It's a post-austerity book. So one Irish minister famously said during the years of the Celtic Tiger that Ireland was closer to Boston than Berlin. But the problem was when Ireland got too close to Boston, it all ended in tears with the financial crash. And one of his arguments is that what tends to characterize the early Celtic Church, particular periods, was precisely its slightly combative peripheral status with regard to centralized authority, and that when the Irish get too close to centralized authority, whether it's the financial authority of Boston, the administrative authority of Brussels, always deeply committed to the European project, or the kind of clerical power of Rome, that's when they're in trouble. And one of the things that Irish does, this minority language, is that almost whether you like it or not, it moves you into these peripheral spaces of one kind or the other. One of the cities that he goes to is the city of Freiburg, which of course is famously and indeed notoriously, because of his rectorship during the Nazi period, is associated with Martin Heidegger. And there is a discussion of Heidegger's work in this account, which is germane to what I'm talking about this evening. Basically, he talks about an essay that Heidegger has published this in 1915 called Die Sprache. Basically, Heidegger's argument in this essay is that the history of philosophy is mainly a history of speaking. It's a history of rhetoric. It's a people engaged in spoken deliberation of one kind or the other. But what you find much less often, something that's much rarer, are histories of listening. He, for Heidegger, there's sort of there are two ways of thinking about a speech. The normal kind of rhetorical speaking thing, die Sprache spricht. But then Connolly quotes the other element of this is der Mensch entspricht. So they kind of they respond to, they pay attention to, they sort of listen to, and this kind of responsiveness, Heidegger says that Entsprechen is hören. So what Connolly does with this thinking, with this notion, is to argue that for a language like Irish, a language that finds itself in this minoritized position, that there are kind of two duties that are incumbent upon the language and the speakers of the language. The first is that it's important not so much to listen to specific individuals speaking the language, but to listen to the language in its entirety, to kind of take a kind of a holistic view of the language in order to identify what are its specificities or differences. That if you like, the perpetual rush to speak often obscures the necessity for hören, of listening, of listening to those specificities and differences that construe or constitute the language world of the language. The other is what he calls the necessity to avoid what he calls sheer ashtru. So sheer ashtru is this kind of notion of perpetual translation. But I think his notion of translation here is not so much translation as an engagement with difference, something that kind of brings out the kind of hermeneutic form, the differences in both of the languages come into contact with each other, but the translation as a kind of mimicry, as a kind of slavish repetition of what is there in the other language. So to some extent, one of the things that he must do as a traveler, one of the things he must do as a writer in Irish is to write about different things differently. One of the memories that Connolly talks about is the time he spent in Canada when he was a graduate student. And he spent a lot of time with Latin American students. And he says at one point, Beirni me nas shud no mar vi me in Éireann. I was more Irish in their midst than I ever was in Ireland. Now, in some ways, this is a classic kind of boundary maintenance thing, that senses of difference, identity, and so on, specificity often come about when you come into contact with difference, except in this case, he sees it as not so much the contact with difference as a contact with similarity that bring out that sense of specificity in him. And he sees this then as part of his kind of, he's traveling as a kind of geopolitical resituating of the Irish. He says, is pobl geskertig edushkert na Hjorpa Shina. So to cut a long story short, we're a southern people in Northern Europe. So at one point or one level, Tarlac McConmey, maybe for climatic reasons, thinks that we're in the wrong place, that we should be somewhere else. Although in terms of climate change, I think we should all be aware of what we might wish for in that particular context. But I think more deeply, it's his notion of how the language itself and the resources in the language itself set up a kind of a relationship or a connection with particular peoples in southern Europe. Not, I think, the one that's often referred to or adverted to, the kind of the cultural religious one, the kind of the shared experience of Catholicism for many southern peoples and the Irish, but more, it seems to me, a kind of a way of thinking about particular experiences through mythical frames. At one stage, when he goes to northern Greece, and he talks about these two figures, the figures of Odysseus and the figure of Oisin. And he says that, you know, what they both have in common is this intense desire to travel and this intense longing for place. What does Odysseus do? He pleads with Calypso to be let back to Ithaca to return to Penelope. What does Oisin do when he's in Tír na Nóg? He pleads with Niamh Cinneoge to be let return to Ireland, where he can be reunited with na Fianna. So he says, about Odysseus and Oisin, atnimid rotáftach fui Odysseus is Oisin agus fuin hen Gréig is éirnig, ní bhain go bhfuil for imlach ach bhfuil leor hefach. Fecin a Gréig an áireamh a fecin siad an níorthar freisin tí bheile agus gcuil stara ach leis. Fecin an áireamh freisin ach fecin an Atlantic all road tí bheile ach sin an seo bhfuil tír na nóg sé sin Mythical. So what in making this kind of distinction, right, or talking about, what unites these two peoples or two places, these kind of mythical figures who both have this kind of nomadic drive, an intense preoccupation with place, who find themselves in this kind of in-between space with different cultures on either sides. I think one of the things that Connolly is omitting is the experiences were radically different. I mean, of course, when Odysseus came back to Ithaca, there was the unfortunate business of the suitors, and they had to be removed before he could be reunited with Penelope. But what happens to Oisin, of course, when he comes back to Ireland, is that he's effectively coming back hundreds of years later, Oisin Nieg Nefania, and there is nobody there to greet him. The Fianna have been replaced by a new tribe, who are Patrick and his Christians, and Oisin feels a kind of a limited sympathy for this new religion and this new world. So there's a kind of sense of estrangement there, a sense that finding himself in this space can never be unproblematic. Inhabiting this language world can never be an unproblematic one. And in this account, this travel account, he uses two cities as a kind of almost a kind of Platonic idea or a psychosocial metaphor to talk about the conflictedness sometimes of being a minority language traveler or narrating travels in a minority language. And this is, so he takes the city of Chur in Switzerland, long associated with the writer Hermann Hesse, the oldest urban settlement in Switzerland, and the city of Derry in Northern Ireland, where part of his family hail from. And one of the things he does is he talks about both cities in terms of the walls, the fortresses, the gates, the divisions, the kind of material expression of divisions within the community. And he talks about, if you like, these divisions, meaning that these cities, what they represent is the city within the city. So that for the speaker of a minority language, that there's always this sense of inhabiting two spaces. So he takes the example of the Irish on the island of Ireland, and where he says that for English speakers in Ireland, the forbidden city is Irish, the city that for one reason or another they are not gaining access to, for whatever that reason might be, and that for Irish speakers, the forbidden city is a kind of Anglophone punitive super ego that has sets of cultural values or perspectives that can get internalized by the Irish language speaker in terms of self-worth, identity, and so on. So there's a sense in which for Connolly, this notion of the forbidden, that brings together these two different places, and of course he's thinking of Romansh, the experience of that minority language in the Swiss context, is what they tend to foreground or bring to the fore, is the kind of irretrievably kind of hybrid nature, and almost nomadic nature of the minority language traveler. One of the words or phrases that he uses, and he uses this in English, is with respect to Derry, is the no-go areas. So the areas during the Troubles between 1969 and 1972, where the security forces didn't go. And one of the things that one could argue is that what Connolly does in this kind of interstitial traveling is that he explores certain no-go areas around language and identity that he sort of feels compelled to explore as a minority language traveler, even if sometimes the truths are difficult and the conclusions awkward. But to some extent, Connolly is a kind of Oisin who finds himself in a new world of changed pieties, different circumstances. And then what he comes up with is often a distinctly unheroic vision of language and place, but also, I think, a vision of potential resistance of alternative and parallel readings. So I suppose to conclude, what I feel about the Irish language travel tradition and looking at the texts of O'Fianachta and Connolly is that what these accounts offer us is ways of thinking about language in movement that are crucial as a way, I think, of challenging certain kind of overly static, overly essentialist, over-spatializing notions of what constitutes language, their speakers, and their identity. But I think I've gone on for quite a while, so I'll stop now and be very happy to take any questions or queries or comments that might have.